The man who owned Manhattan for 48 hours. In the heart of the Gilded Age, before the electric glow of Wall Street erased the gaslight shadows, America was a country built on promises. Promises of victory, of reunion, and of gold. The year was 1873. The air in New York City was thick with a humid post-war arrogance. The smoke from burgeoning industry mixed with the sweet, sickening aroma of wealth being made and lost in equal measure. This was the moment when America officially became the world's financial engine. But what few people knew was that the engine had a crippling, secret defect, introduced not by foreign enemies, but by a ghost from the continent's past and a master of illusion. Our story begins not on the crowded docks of Manhattan, but in the polished, silent offices of the United States Sub-Treasury Building, a massive marble fortress on Wall Street, directly across from the New York Stock Exchange. This building housed a sum of money greater than the annual budgets of most European kingdoms. It was the absolute nerve center of American capital. And on a blistering afternoon in late August, an assistant cashier named William Darrow, a good, solid New England name, implying trustworthiness, stood over a vault ledger, his brow furrowed with a confusion that was rapidly turning to panic.
State secret. His operation was less a criminal scheme and more a sophisticated reverse engineering of the entire U.S. financial system. The Great Swindle, a conspiracy of scale. Biddle hadn't worked alone. He had formed an unlikely cabal of geniuses. Thomas E. Clark, a former bank clerk from a respected New York family, whose knowledge of ledger systems was unmatched. He was the internal vulnerability. The Duke, a master engraver from the Swiss-Italian border who possessed the near-magical skill to replicate the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing's plates. He was the craftsman. And Biddle himself, the charismatic mastermind who could talk his way into any bank president's office and convince him to accept millions in hot paper. He was the salesman and the brain. Their scheme was simple, brilliant, and devastating. They counterfeited the plates, printed the bonds, and then, using a network of unwitting European brokers, they began to sell them back to the United States government itself. The Treasury, under the impression they were simply buying back legitimate debt to reduce the national burden, was using its own gold reserves to buy its own fake bonds from an international conspiracy. It was the ultimate parasitic operation. By the time William Darrow realized the depth of the betrayal, Biddle and his team had already laundered millions. But they had one final audacious target: the New York Clearinghouse and the Sub-Treasury's vaults. Their plan was to execute a coordinated financial strike, simultaneously dumping the last massive shipment of bonds onto the market, triggering a massive sell-off and using the resulting chaos to cash out their final haul. The amount they were about to introduce would be so large, over $6 million in fake notes, that it would essentially represent a controlling interest in the fluid capital of Manhattan. The stage was set for a confrontation. The nascent, powerful American financial system against a handful of international aristocratic conmen. The fate of the entire post-Civil War economy was suddenly hanging on the meticulous work of a single, terrified assistant cashier and the shadowy agents of the fledgling United States Secret Service. The countdown had begun. If Darrow couldn't expose the conspiracy in the next 48 hours, the price of the bond, the foundation of American credit, would plummet. Confidence would evaporate, and a handful of criminals would have accomplished what the entire Confederate Army had failed to do: bankrupt the United States.
The Treasury Department's printing process was a heavily guarded national secret, relying on multiple layers of protection. Banknote paper, a custom blend of cotton and linen with silk fibers embedded, intaglio engraving,
a deep, tactile print that was almost impossible to replicate cheaply, and distinctive numbering schemes. The first, chilling discovery came from the Sub-Treasury's William Darrow. The counterfeiters had solved the paper problem. Through a series of brilliant deductions, later revealed to involve bribing a mill worker in Massachusetts, they had obtained large batches of authentic, unissued U.S. banknote paper. The silk fibers were real, the weight and feel were perfect. This meant the fight was purely about the engraving. Brooks's team painstakingly compared a real 520 bond with the recovered fake. The differences were infinitesimally small, perceptible only to the trained eye of a master printer. The real bond's portrait of Secretary Chase had a cross-hatching pattern that was just a fraction deeper. The title, Register of the Treasury, had a slightly softer curve in the capital R. Only a craftsman of impossible skill, known in the trade as a photographer-engraver, could have produced this work. This pointed to Biddle's man, the Duke. Brooks put out feelers through every print shop, every artistic studio, and every dark alley where disgraced engravers sold their trade, from Boston to Philadelphia, for anyone who had recently acquired specialized equipment or had been asking suspicious questions about intaglio printing plates. The internal leak, Thomas Clark. While the agent pursued the technical side, the political pressure mounted. Key bankers in London and Paris began demanding to know if their Treasury bond holdings were genuine. The very rumor of a collapse could trigger a withdrawal of European capital, crippling American reconstruction. Brooks's breakthrough came not from an engraving lead, but from the money itself. The $4.4 million had to be introduced through the financial system, and every transaction leaves a trace. By tracing the sequence of canceled checks and bills of exchange, Brooks's team tracked the initial, largest deposits to a series of accounts linked to a previously respectable figure, Thomas E. Clark. Clark, the former bank clerk, was the conspirators' essential money launderer. He was their face, using his clean reputation to move the hot paper through the New York financial markets and into legitimate international banks. Brooks
knew the choice of location was deliberate. Colonel George Biddle was a man who moved in the confidence of the elite. He understood that no one would suspect a massive financial crime being orchestrated in full view of the city's most honest and respected citizens. Clark disappeared into the grand entrance. Brooks, with remarkable calm, stationed his men. One took a position across the street, watching the main door. Another positioned himself near the service entrance. Brooks and his third man, disguised in the heavy, respectable coats of gentlemen waiting for their wives, entered the lobby. They scanned the private dining rooms. Clark was nowhere in the main hall. He had been ushered into a private room on the second floor, reserved for transactions of the utmost discretion. The Colonel's Last Supper. Brooks approached the maître d'hôtel, flashing a special government identification and a crisp $50 bill, a small fortune in 1873. "A national emergency," Brooks whispered, his voice low and firm. "We need to know who is with Mr. Clark in the private dining room." The maitre d', blanching at the gravity in Brooks's eyes, quickly consulted his reservation book. "A party of two, sir. Mr. Clark and a Mr. G. Barton." Brooks's mind processed the information instantly. G. Barton was a common alias used by European criminals to imply British or aristocratic lineage. This had to be Colonel Biddle. They had no time for warrants. The final payload of $6 million in fake bonds was almost certainly on the table. If they waited, Biddle might slip out through a back corridor or destroy the evidence. Brooks gave the silent signal. His third operative, a sturdy man named Miller, kicked open the door to the private room. The scene inside was breathtakingly composed. Two men sat at a mahogany table, scattered with plates of untouched food, fine wine, and a large, flat, leather-bound briefcase, Clark's portfolio. Colonel George Biddle was every inch the part. immaculately tailored, with a silver-tipped cane resting against his chair, a diamond stick pin flashing on his cravat, and an air of cultured superiority that made the Secret Service agents feel like mere footmen. The evidence and the lie. "Gentlemen," Biddle drawled, without rising, "to what do we owe the pleasure? We are concluding a substantial private investment." "United States Secret Service, Colonel," Brooks announced, drawing his pistol. "You are under arrest for conspiracy and counterfeiting U.S. Treasury bonds." Biddle merely sighed, an expression of profound boredom crossing his face. "Bonds? Counterfeiting?"
The U.S. Treasury immediately understood the terrifying implication. The plates were geopolitical liability. If they fell into the hands of a hostile government, say Russia or Spain, who were still wary of the powerful newly united United States, they could be used to flood the global markets with fake U.S. debt, instantly destroying America's international credit. Secretary Richardson acted with unprecedented haste. He could not rely on traditional diplomatic channels, which were slow and often corrupted by local interests. He needed a man of action. Agent James J. Brooks, the man who had faced down Biddle, was given new orders: board the fastest steamer to Europe, hunt down the Duke, find and seize the plates. Do not involve foreign governments unless absolutely necessary. In the dawn hours before the news of Biddle's arrest hit the papers, Brooks was on a ferry to a waiting steamer, bound for London. His mission had transformed from a domestic policing job into an urgent international espionage operation, a race against time to save the financial reputation of the United States on foreign soil. Next steps. The story will now focus entirely on the international hunt. London, Hamburg, and the hunt for the plates. Brooks's efforts to navigate 19th century European cities, relying on a sparse network of contacts, following the cold trail of a master engraver known only by a nickname. The climax in the studio, the discovery of the Duke, the confrontation, and the seizure of the plates, the ultimate evidence. The aftermath, the legal battle, Biddle's conviction, and the permanent legacy of this great swindle on U.S. currency security. Across the Atlantic, the trail to Hamburg. Agent James J. Brooks spent the 9-day transatlantic voyage planning his infiltration. He carried minimal baggage, but an immense burden, the fate of America's credit. He knew that the moment Biddle's arrest was publicized in the European papers, the Duke would vanish, taking the irreplaceable plates with him. Brooks landed in London and immediately went to the U.S. legation, but kept his mission strictly confidential. He needed information, not diplomacy. His only reliable lead was Thomas Clark's confession. The engraver, known as the Duke, had set up his clandestine workshop in the large free-port city of Hamburg, Germany. Hamburg was a nexus of international trade, shadow banking, and anonymity.
He positioned himself for the evening raid. At midnight, accompanied by a single carefully bribed local watchman, who was paid handsomely to simply look the other way, Brooks forced the side door. The basement workshop was a stark, terrifying sight. In the center of the room sat a massive hand-cranked intaglio rolling press, heavy enough to withstand the immense pressure needed for steel engraving. Stacks of pristine, unnumbered bond paper, the same authentic paper found in New York, were piled high, ready to be run through the press. The Duke was there, not fleeing, but frantically trying to destroy his life's work. He was a small, intense man, his hands stained with ink. He was using a grinding wheel to attempt to obliterate the etched lines on the steel plates. Brooks drew his pistol. "Stop the Duke, it's over." The engraver whirled around, a heavy hammer raised. A brief, violent struggle ensued in the dim light of the single gas lamp. The Duke, driven by the desperation of a captured master craftsman, fought fiercely to save his plates. Brooks managed to subdue him, knocking the hammer away. More importantly, he secured the grinding wheel before significant damage was done. Lying on the workbench, wrapped in thick oilcloth, were the prize, 3 perfect heavy steel engraving plates, etched with such microscopic fidelity that they were indistinguishable from the official US Treasury plates. This was not just evidence, this was the factory of the crime. The return and the final verdict. Brooks immediately secured the plates and the engraver, using his authority and a hefty payment to arrange for the quickest, safest transport. The plates, wrapped and sealed by an official of the US legation, were rushed back to America, while the Duke was held quietly in Europe pending extradition. The seizure of the plates was the final, devastating blow to Biddle's defense. Back in New York, the subsequent trial of Colonel George Biddle and Thomas Clark became a national spectacle. The plates themselves were brought into the courtroom, the tangible proof of a massive, sophisticated conspiracy. Biddle's aristocratic confidence finally broke. The overwhelming evidence, the seized bonds, Clark's testimony, and the foreign recovered plates left no doubt. Colonel George Biddle was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in solitary confinement at Sing Sing prison. Thomas Clark received a slightly lesser sentence for cooperating. The true historical significance of the great swindle was this: it served as a brutal, necessary lesson for a young, rapidly industrializing nation. Legacy: the birth of modern currency security. The consequences of the Biddle swindle were immediate and profound. The rebirth of the Secret Service, the agency's success in this case cemented its essential role. It received increased funding and authority, establishing the foundation for its eventual expanded mission beyond counterfeiting. Currency reform: the US Treasury was forced to completely overhaul its security features. They adopted more complex multi